So I'm Canadian and I've been living in the United States for 18 months. And honestly, it's been one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. Not because America is better or worse than Canada, but because it's different in ways that I never expected, ways that don't show up in the stereotypes or news coverage. It's not just about healthcare or guns or politics, though I'm still going to talk about that. It's in the everyday rhythms, the unspoken rules. So today, I wanted to share my observations about America that surprised me as a Canadian. Some of them made me fall in love with different aspects of this country, and others made me appreciate home in ways that I never have before. Let's get into it. So, number one, the obvious one, the size in the market. There are way more people in America. Everything they do is way bigger. There are more opportunities for work as a result. There are more different people. You can go different places and try different things because there are hundreds of millions more people in this country than Canada. The most notable one that I really enjoy is the fact that anything I order on Amazon is significantly cheaper than when I ordered it in Canada. And it also always comes overnight. That's probably the best part about the size of the market being a lot bigger in your day-to-day life. Number two is that you get what you give. In Canada, services are a lot more accessible. In the United States, they are also accessible if you pay for them. And you're paying more in order to get higher quality or quicker access. In Canada, obviously, it's super easy to access healthcare. All you need is a health card. The government gives it to you. They make it super easy for you to get one. Another service that is very accessible in Canada is education. Education is very well mandated across all of the provinces because in Canada, our education is managed at the provincial level, which is equal to the state level. It's way more uncommon in Canada to send your children to private school, as well as going to private universities. Our best institutions in the country are public, and the amount of tuition that they're allowed to charge is federally regulated, and it's always an amount that is very manageable for a family to afford. I went to one of the best schools in Canada, and my tuition was only around $8,000 a year, so incredibly cheap. In the United States, those services are still available, but the best ones cost more money, and you have to pay more. It is very much a you get what you give culture. And this also is apparent in places that aren't just public institutions. You can pay for a nicer airline if you want. You can fly Frontier or you can fly Delta. That optionality exists because of one, the market size, and two, that's just how America operates. The next thing I see very differently in the United States versus being home in Canada is the focus on assimilation. Canada really applauds otherness, a multiculturalism. I learned a lot about the cultures of my friends who were also immigrants in Canada growing up. The United States does not really applaud immigrants and multiculturalism like Canada does. They really focus on assimilation. It's important to become American, to fit in, to be patriotic. You see people of all different cultures celebrating the 4th of July. You do not see people of all different cultures celebrating Canada Day. It's not that important. And I would go as far as to argue that I believe Canadians are actually truly more patriotic, but Americans are much more performatively patriotic, and that really shows itself a lot in terms of assimilation and immigration. The next thing that's very different in the United States is the proximity to extremes. And by that, I mean you see a lot more across the entire spectrum of what capitalism has to offer. Homelessness is more visible, wealth being much more extreme, and the consequences of failure being significantly more severe. The stakes just feel higher in the United States, and this does a really good job of creating both inspiration as well as anxiety. There is just very, very drastic shows on both sides of how hard it is to be homeless or poor or live in a shanty town. Well, at the same time, there are people, 2 blocks away that are living in mansions. It really inspires you to be that person in a mansion, but it makes you a lot more afraid that you are probably statistically closer to the person in the shanty town or the homeless person than the billionaire that lives, a few blocks away from some of the poorest people in America. The fifth thing that I see very differently in the United States than Canada is mobility and the culture of ambition. In the United States, especially as a newcomer, the ambition feels really palpable and it feels very energizing. Ambition is a lot more overt, risk is rewarded much more highly, and scaling is possible. At the same time, that same drive can feel exhausting. It's a lot more transactional and less community oriented as a result of everybody being on this rat race or this hamster wheel where they're inevitably trying to make more money, be better, be more ambitious. So it's something that's very different in Canada where everyone's really just focused on having a job, a simple house, and people in America are trying to get to that Super Bowl, trying to buy that private jet. This is one that I could not leave out, but is pretty obvious to most people. It's that the political fragmentation of the United States States is much more significant. The US feels very politically polarized, and it always has. The difference in political views across the country is very drastic. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely liberals and Republicans in Canada, but it's a little bit different. Our sliding scale of politics is much smaller. The difference in values is not as stark as it is between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. The next thing that's very different is the consumption culture. Because the US market is so large, which I've already talked about, there's a lot of potential to earn more and scale bigger and invest bigger. But because of that, the cost of living in many US cities is very high, and the culture of consumption can make it even heavier. You want to get a nicer car, you want to get a bigger house, you want to have a bigger lifestyle. You're very inspired to make a lot of money, to work very hard, which is great, but all that does is push up your life. Lifestyle creep is definitely a very real thing. You get a better job, and all of a sudden you think, well, maybe I should drive a nicer car. Maybe I should get a new phone. And that is much more prevalent in a place where salaries and the culture of consumption is much more evident. The next thing, and the thing that might be one of the hardest things for me to adjust to being in the United States, is having kind of a global mindset and the shift in influence. So living in the United States gives you exposure to obviously one of the largest global platforms in the world. Media is big, business is big, culture is big. I grew up on American television. I watched American news channels. I was in a different country, and America has so much sway that people are still tuned into those things. I was Canadian. I barely knew anything about American football, and yet we still watched the Super Bowl. Canada gives you a lot of room to be you and not really feel like you're part of this big machine that's pushing out content and information and capitalism worldwide. In the US, you feel very replaceable as a result. You know that you're just a little cog in a wheel. You are definitely a small fish in a way bigger pond. And if you're a person who has the level of ambition to immigrate to a new country, you were probably a big fish in a small pond before you moved here. So it's something that's quite interesting for people to adapt to, and learning to kind of still develop otherness in a place where otherness is not as celebrated as your home country, as well as it's much harder to develop that other because profit and success comes when you are a cog in a wheel and you just try and become a bigger cog as opposed to a different type of person. The last thing that I find is quite different in the United States is the relationship that citizens have with the government. Although this is definitely shifting in Canada and we are losing trust, I find that Canadians generally trust institutions, specifically public institutions, much more, even when they're criticizing them. Canadians love to hate on our healthcare. We love to complain about how the wait time is so long and da 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 da. But then if somebody in your family gets incredibly sick, you're going to trust that institution entirely. And at the end of the day, you're not going to have a $230,000 bill just because somebody has cancer. Americans have a foundational skepticism of government baked into their DNA. They love to question authority. They love to make sure that the government is doing things that are benefiting specifically them as an individual rather than the community of Americans. And if the party that they like is not in power, they're incredibly skeptical of the ability of the other party to operate a government. That definitely does exist in Canada, but they still understand that things are going to get done and the checks and balances of government are going to keep them safe. I think having a relationship with the government affects everything from things like pandemic responses to business regulations, which are really important and changes the fabric of a country. Being here and seeing it firsthand has really made it obvious how different the country's relationship with its government is than with Canada's government. So those are all the things that I see differently in the United States than when I lived in Canada. I think there are a bunch of different things that culturally shift America to be very different than Canada, despite a lot of people thinking that they're very similar. At the end of the day, I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to live in both countries, and I definitely see the validity of both sides of all of the points that I brought up today. Thanks for watching.